Hello everyone, today we talk about the late medieval Hungarian army organization and more specifically of the Banderia and the exercitus generalis. We will make other videos about the militia portalis, the Black Army, the mercenaries in general, the auxiliary forces of the very large Hungarian kingdom, but it was something similar to an empire. A certain degree, and also the artillery, the river forces, and so on, that all deserve kind of a dedicated attention. Today we talk, however, what was probably the core of the Hungarian army, both the royal and probably the vassal one alike. So largely the kingdom feudal force. In a phase of Hungarian history that we have discussed here and there, have a medieval Hungary playlist, but we need to make many more videos about this, and specifically about this period that had undergone a very important regime change following the accession to the throne of Charles Robert of Anjou, ruling between 1308 and 1342. Right, with the death of Andrew III in 1301, the Arpad dynasty had come to an end after centuries of rule. Right? And this member of the French Angevin family, which had ruled southern Italy and parts of Greece, plus in the Holy Roman Empire part at least, was the County of Anjou, then properly within the core of France, and these were essentially peers of the same French king, and this is the peak of French power in Europe and the moment of essentially greatest contraction of imperial power. The Angevins came to rule in Hungary, in Poland, etc. So it's the peak properly of their parabola, and as such, Hungary received through them also a great wave of change, right? The struggle that had brought Charles Robert in power had been brief, right? But he had been working substantially to curb the power of the barons that had always been the main problem in the Hungarian kingdom. The fact that ever since the Magyar settlements, and also the further shape that properly the country took from a political and social point of view, the oligarchy in a relatively decentralized country had always had a great importance. This was in part the traditional Magyar feeling regarding this kind of egalitarianism, read basically the mob not wanting somebody to step into their private business against any form of statal development. And the period, naturally, that we study today, talking about late Middle Ages, as you know, is the moment essentially of failure of the great Central European monarchies, Hungary included. Hungary was the one that, even though the most powerful one, was the one that underwent the most catastrophic disaster with the Ottoman invasions and so on. But this was the fate, the destiny of all, in fact, the major Central European powers that essentially turned into elective monarchies with a very weak central power, or at least it wasn't so weak for definitely not even pre-modern, but also for most of the early modern age standards. Right, we're talking about the same Hungary at some point was very powerful. The same Poland was one of the major powers in Europe and so on, but in practice, when we look at the quality of the system, and we will analyze this through the same Banderium here, that is the key, militarily speaking, to read the thing, you realize that these were essentially a set of principalities, with a major one embodied by the royal house that had traditionally been the Arpad one, and this is yet another characteristic of Central European monarchies, like the Przemyslids in Bohemia, the same Piasts in Poland, etc. We're talking about, again, ancestral dynasties that had managed actually to consolidate power more unitarily in relative terms than other countries from a political territorial point of view, simply because these lands in Central Europe had been feudalized later than the Western European countries on the wake of Frankish expansion, whether well, it was always military at the end of the day, even for countries like England or Sicily, as you know. That albeit again having initially in high medieval times, when the same Magyars could exploit them, in fact, with their raids against essentially a fragmenting, a privatizing system, had begun to develop as states due to, also kind of greater advancement in general, civilizationally speaking, more resources, etc. Exactly as feudal monarchies, right? And that towards the end of the Middle Ages were actually compacting their statal power in a way that would really brought, as you know, the history of Europe beyond. And the reason why these Western dynasties, we're talking about the Habsburgs, the Luxembourgs, the Anjou, and they looked east exactly because in the West they had consolidated enough power, sometimes like in the case of the Angevins, so that some branches could properly spread elsewhere, or to seek a greater aggrandizement for minor dynasties like the Luxembourg ones that weren't particularly more powerful than others within their context. And this could be done, of course, only thanks to the support of the local ethnic nobility that, in one sense, was, yes, seeking to aggrandize their own personal, private power, just like in the West, but at the same time also required a stable context where to do this. So the game was always the same. It was somebody supporting the king where he was. There are sane people that were, as long as they were the noble opposition, they would be anti centralization. Then when they became kingdom themselves, obviously centralized, because that was always the entire thing, right? Having a system that is strong enough to manage to curb the resistance, the kind of the centrifugal, the extremistic fringe, and then at the same time from the other side realizing that this system wouldn't be able to weaken the system that existed locally at the same time. It's a very delicate balance that is a bit the sample of the same civilization, the recipe for the most successful countries in the world historically, from a modern point of view, as we can still see, in the quality of everything today, frankly, in the West, and that within the same Europe you can measure through these very interesting influences. And in fact, in the Hungarian case, differently from, for example, this happened actually with a bit everywhere where this Western dynasties implanted themselves in Central Europe. But there was a wave, an influence that brought with it just a different political, military, and social model, right? The power of the barons was curbed because of the power of the Anjou International, right? French Gothic and Italian humanistic culture spread across Hungary as a consequence of the Angevin rule. And so also kind of more advanced military ideas, right? At this point, historically, what you see happening in the West, and that was a problem also for the same French, for other powers, but that follows that pattern of modernization is fundamentally the professionalization of the troops, also in practice the semi-permanence of the same. This is something that costs a lot and requires a statal apparatus, a tax system, etc. So a degree of centralization that a power like Hungary had not had, except for the fact that, as we were saying before, Hungary was a much larger country than many others. It controlled fundamentally other peoples, and in a much kind of more ethnically diverse way than simply saying, I don't know, the Occitans were different from the French or things like this. And that in this regard was, however, more militarized traditionally, also thanks to the fact, so in the sense that you can fundamentally wage campaigns all around. There is always somebody to tame, to curb, to suppress, which was also reinforced by essentially the steppes tradition that had somehow lived in the Magyar political and military tradition. There were certain areas of ethnic Hungary that still were, at least, okay, the most underdeveloped in a way, but still living with a sort of essentially semi-nomadic lifestyle. For this reason, they had been settled actually by external semi-nomadic groups such as the Cumans that, as you know, had played a major role. The same Arpads had been eventually had Cuman blood in the process, and they had support. This was just like the old idea that the external, even the pagan in this sense, so the infidel, but is somehow a more reliable subject than the local ethnic nobleman, because first of all, he's just like an immigrant. In that case, especially if Hungary was refugees from the Mongol invasions, right? And as you know, Hungary itself had been significantly invested by the Mongol invasions, albeit also it had recovered quite quickly compared to other states, and the Mongols had fundamentally not even tried to settle in the Hungarian plain, despite the fact that it could have been fruitful as steppe peoples themselves, but also thanks to peoples like these and the, in fact, least civilized that inhabited the frontiers and so on, because you can find fundamentally nomadic populations, but they are heavily invested also by nomadic elements that live as raiders, fundamentally. Just think about Wallachia, right? How exposed it was just to the to the nomadic steppes, and how the sense lots of people from there arrived as mercenaries / just looters to join in this broader raids, for example, against the Byzantine-held areas through Bulgaria and so on. This is even truer for Central and Eastern Europe after the Mongol invasions. The Mongol invasions had shattered dramatically, especially Eastern Europe, that fundamentally becomes a Tartar vassal, and as such, the properly the tyranny, right, the authoritarianism, the systematic unhingement of the oligarchs at the expense of essentially middle kind of estates that had been quite productive. Think even about in the Kievan Rus, right? How the fact that the princely power had been somehow balanced, more similar to Western Europe in a sense, by some, trade elements, communal elements almost, right? In Russia was completely wiped out, right? What we have there is, especially in the most faithful vassals of the Mongols, that is the Muscovy, the identical political and military copy of the Mongol system. These were essentially Mongol states. And this is dramatically overlooked in the history of the region. It was accompanied eventually by also some other factors that were related in a way in the broader intercontinental game. That is the 14th century crisis, the mid 14th century crisis specifically, that of course also brought to a collapse of the kind of the middle classes, also all over Europe, as you know, the rise of the oligarchs, and effectively what we call as the Ancien regime, that, as we were saying before, in the case of the West, still managed to preserve the statal system that had developed and fundamentally developed forward from a positive point of view. Whereas in these states that had essentially never had something like that, they had always relied again on private oligarchic power at the end of the day, the state was aborted, and such also its fate on the shorter or longer run was sealed, right? And what is important in the Angevin rise to power and military reform, partially as we will see now, is the attempt to, in fact, mold Hungary according to the models, or as much as possible for the local land. In fact, the opposition of the native nobility, according to the Western system, to the Western, in fact, organization. This was naturally very complicated because at the beginning of the 14th century, when the Anjou installed themselves as kings, still the crisis is not entirely evident, right? The Angevins actually are at the peak of their power in absolute terms. Again, they are fundamentally hegemonic in Italy and not just in the southern part. They own quite powerful fiefs, again, in Provence, in the Anjou itself. Even if they lose Sicily with the Vespers, they have possessions in Greece, right? They are backed by France, that is the most powerful country in Europe. So they are essentially Capetians themselves. So we made videos on this topic. Perhaps we didn't focus specifically on the Angevins as the dynasty per se. We just talked about either Charles of Anjou or the Kingdom of Naples and so on. But this was a big system that again reaches as far as Poland and so on, dynastically, because that's obviously the only way, as we've seen, as in contemporary state times, to have to extend power, to float on the base of these local communities, right? And after his accession to the throne, Charles Robert worked to, first of all, as we've seen, suppress the internal opposition, and then creating as such a new establishment, a new aristocracy, to replace what were known in Hungary properly as the Little Kings of the late Arpad dynasty era. It was fundamental to frame them in an order, both through the injection of more faithful clienteles and properly also asserting royal power by requiring a greater military contribution under the royal banner. And this is dramatically important. So especially the new aristocrats, here we don't have to think it was literally an establishment, a replacement entirely. This was the problem in the first place. Yes, people could change, but the problems of a pre-industrial state, coercively speaking, really not, because even if you had somebody who was kind of more loyal to you and was, say, French or Italian, and installed in the place of a former oligarch, that Hungarian oligarch had been taken out, still these men were to enter the local game. They were, I don't know, settled on the frontier in faraway areas where they had essentially to negotiate with first of all with their own vassals that were native Hungarians, other Hungarian oligarchs that were still there. And so essentially their political, military, and social needs would overlap with the ones of the former oligarchs. So, of course, the substitution was not so dramatic. It was always supported. This is the important thing. This could not happen if it had not received support by the same Hungary, and thus by the oligarchs that were de facto the only people who ruled. And in this period, that's what fundamentally gets down to, because again, in the late Middle Ages, there is that brutal privatization and oligarchization, and especially in countries like this, where again the nobility affirms itself as the sole establishment, right? And the important thing, though, was to reorganize, to rationalize, to somehow render more homogeneous, more standard, in a way, the feudal military service. This is a problem that we have seen for the same French during the 100 Years' War. Recently I made multiple videos about the, you can find it in the medieval French warfare playlist about the French army organization, the later, in the 15th century, but still this video's time, organization of the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, so as finally stable, permanent companies. And what were the actual problems with the French military organization to bring to the defeats against the English during the multi-secular conflict? And as we've seen, it's not just the French or the English, as it's normally conceived in a technologistic and a positivistic sense, fought in different ways. They basically used literally the same tactics, right? Even the flank, the missile wing, infantry wings at the end of the day, this kind of chamber of death in between, etc. was not an English invention per se. These tactics were used basically by all armies in Europe. And just the English were the better system that knew how to exploit them successfully in very dire straits, by the way, that also imposed them, for example, to dismount at a point is that people have somehow formulated that was a sort of doctrine, ante litteram. That there was some English habituation to that and flexibility and ability to adapt like that, but it was not essentially a different way of fighting also from the rest of the army. So the huge problem for big countries like France and Hungary, in this case, this is also a very important thing, again, to stress. Hungary was huge, right? It dominated an enormous area, the stretch from Slovakia to Serbia, from Dalmatia to Moldavia, and beyond. Technically, they interfered in the Rus. As we'll see, the same Angevins of Hungary, of course, bring Hungarian power to intervene in Italy. They fought against outside, essentially, the first of all, the Hungarian ethnic borders, but again, this was entailed by the same nature of the Hungarian Empire. But even again, exposing Hungarian military culture to quite interesting range of influences that are better seen, especially in the video I will make on the auxiliaries, on the mercenaries per se. But the point being, having to manage the system and the cost that this entailed, right? Because the larger the system, the more in relative terms you have to employ, right? This is the reason why such big countries such as France, I don't know, that had boomed in the 13th century, eventually had difficulties to organize, to re-homogenize, to give a standard discipline to its own forces. Not because we're talking about the 14th century. How do you think they differed in practice from, I don't know, the Germans, the English, the Spanish? We're the same thing, except what really, I mean, from a strictly military point of view, you can't really distinguish much of a knight during the 14th century on an ethnic base in Europe. Even Hungarian knight, as an elite, fundamentally, yes, may maintain some little styles, preferences, fashions, reminiscences of that ethnic Magyar tradition, but it's essentially identical to any other, especially in this case, Western, Central European men-at-arms, right? This is yet another deeply important aspect of the story. Hungary had been, military-wise, much more under the German, the Italian influx than the Byzantine one, right? Even though historically it was coming mostly from the other way around. And one of other powers, even beyond Constantinople, which is often overlooked, we will see it partly now, also because the Ottomans, frankly, were knocking at Hungary's doors, gates, as you know, at this point, and there was an influence also from that direction. So, discipline, authority, this is what remains the greatest challenge in every age, in every civilization, etc. You have to impose your own force, your own command, because if you don't have political unity, you cannot have a military success in the first place. And for such big countries, again, with such low centralized levels, it's particularly difficult. Especially, again, when you have to negotiate regularly on this very, very powerful oligarchs that de facto, as we'll see now, own states within the kingdom in this sense, the broader state, right? And that they are such as they can, because they essentially the nobody has ever been able to dislodge them from there. And on the contrary, in order to have a grip on the frontiers, mostly happen, they would confer greater power to that de facto private system. It's how also the modern state in the Western countries had occurred, right? At some point, you make somebody so powerful that becomes almost your peer as royalty. You marry into them, and so on. And so eventually you manage to unify even under, say, Castile and Aragon, and that's how, on the longer run, you have a broader Spain. So it was just a natural course of things, except this system was huge, and without much of the super, structural authority that other countries had already been developing significantly for the wall, right? For the rest, Hungary was a hell of a military power, as we will see now. Just another problem we have with it is that it's relatively less documented, of course, than what we see in the West. These areas do not give us the same identical degree of documentation like in the West, also because of that lack of more centralized structures, also because of the later Ottoman destructions, probably the collapse of the Hungarian system that, as you know, remained somehow a frontier area parceled between the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, and plus all the other, let's say, also vassal states, especially in the northeast, throughout all the modern age. And very often we get, as we'll see in the end, especially about organic, some gross exaggerations that are, especially from a numerical point of view, that are typical also of some Western chroniclers in general, wherever, especially they talk about faraway places. And we have other terms of comparison with other countries for which they did the same, like in Spain, for example, is this claiming, I don't know, there were 100,000 men. Yeah, my eyes, right? If there were 50,000, it was a miracle of logistics for anything you could see in the world at that point. In any case, especially single armies were essentially at best 30,000 men. And we're talking about effective fighting force, which is, you can even bring more people together, but it would be useless. And so that's also why they didn't do it. And there is no proof that they did. So in any case, the point of the reform entailed mostly that every vassal, right, had to, of course, to provide its own feudal military service, and in addition to that, which, as you know, entailed the idea that you had to provide for troops just because you had been given land for free, or at least in order exactly to supply them, had to establish and maintain a personal company of armored horsemen called a Banderium, which were usually recruited, or at least mostly, from the lesser nobility, up to a certain point at least, of the estates of this aristocrats, and partly from foreign mercenaries, right? The Banderium, plural Banderia in Latin, comes from the Italian bandiera, that is flag, which was an organic unit that was indicated with this name, naturally in a time which the standard numbers weren't quite fixed, if not within a range that could really vary importantly. At least the concept of Banderium is having, in fact, a banner was something more than just a normal flag, right? So a banner the Banderia. These are the terms you find also in Middle Latin and so on, that were considered as a more unitary unit, that is properly not something formed just out of the sum of multiple companies per se, even though the organization could actually be done like that, but that were counted in this sense as a more permanent aggregation. You know that the Banderium, as we will see now, will in fact would come to indicate organically different things, but it had to mostly revolve around the concept of having essentially a battle line made up by them, right? At least those were the standards that were somehow required. So as you understand, what this reform entailed was a bit the classical situation that had happened everywhere. The feudal system was a farce, right? In the moment in which you gave the land to your own vassal, or better, you simply told one of your guys to go occupy somebody else's land and succeed in it, you didn't have a real control on that land. So what feudalism and feudal service had turned into was actually beginning to pay your own vassals for military service, which again, in terms of the original vassalic beneficiary system, doesn't make any sense, right? Because again, in the moment you receive the land, you're already prepaid for the service you have to provide for on a land that is technically public, right? That is it's royal domain. So if the king wants, he can't take you away from. So instead, as you know, in the feudal world, as we've seen many times, the concept of allodium had came about. So the lands that de facto could not be touched even by the king, by tradition, by custom, the local people, because of course the juridical thought was revolving, was swinging between these two extremes, right? The idea that there was still a universal authority that had the right, if anything, even to take with force if it succeeded by God's will, and another, so the imperial one, and another one that was just, again, the imperium of the single communities that could resist the king, and if they successfully did so, they had won their own right in the process, which I think is a very beautiful thing, because it's literally how even today's world still works, how humanity really works in practice, whether you want to pretend there is law as a juridical fiction, whatever, but at the end of the day, it gets down to strength ratios. And as we were saying, ruling a country in the Middle Ages was definitely much more difficult than it is today. And so what mostly the king, again, ruled was his own estate within many other estates, and managing to exert a bit more kind of power gradually, and eroding this other ownings, and essentially compacting the countries for the kingdom's force, whichever domain was the crown's, in the face mostly of an onslaught. As we will see now, most military service was owed within the especially the one of the generalis exercitus by tradition within just the country's boundaries. The Banderium was different, because the Banderium entailed instead that de facto that professional force that was to also fuel itself in that kind of, again, Magyar mentality mode that you have just to subjugate systematically other peoples around, just like the ancestors of at least some of these people had done in the steppes, and even against the rest of Europe, before being kind of framed within this more Frankish system that the Angevins were somehow reinforcing and updating to the Western standards. So in practice, this was an additional service that the king owed from the top of its acquired power now, and that was levied in practice just like any other vassal would have recruited its own retinues. And as we will see now, there is an idea that the Banderium was a sort of little army within the army. A bit like, in fact, commanders of fortune used to do with their own companies, right? Because they weren't just knights, they weren't just men-at-arms, let's say better at this point, but essentially also the whole tactical complement, right? Plus, of course, the field aids and so on. So the Banderium had to be technically also for the vassal's interest in a way, just fully a complete tactical force. Even if it was small, again, the tactical complement was always there. This is true for every army in Europe at this point. You don't have armies that say, you phone one guy and you say, well, I will just bring the cavalry, you bring the militia. It doesn't work like that, right? At least the army that is formed at a properly organizational level that has to go on campaign is already fully equilibrated in that regard. Of course, you can have different ratios of cavalry and infantry depending on, I don't know, there's some interesting ethnic divide, as we were saying, between some areas in Hungary and the other. But it's also true that by late medieval times and throughout that process, the aforementioned process of oligarchization, professionalization, privatization, what really counts at the end of the day is the men-at-arms and its retinue, right? So these Banderia would be counted effectively on the base of that. Some vassals had even more than one Banderium, which is pretty normal if you think about that, because you could dispose of them in different ways. And as we were saying before, these units were of substantial dimensions, often comprising something between 5 and 1,000, sometimes even more than 1,000 men, meaning properly men-at-arms, right? This is another important aspect you get from the sources that from this time start practically talking about just in terms of number of men-at-arms. And the reason being that, again, those communal infantries of the previous generations had reached their peak. Now were going down, right? And the oligarchs were taking over. Those same communes were basically asking for that as a sort of protection because warfare was becoming ever more expensive. There were technological advancements that made panoplies costing ever more. Just as a lifestyle, training with them was not possible for ever more people, right? And those really had enriched in the previous centuries, as even commoners were now just being co-opted with, I don't know, the mercantile elite, whatever. Whereas the masses were ever more dispossessed and somehow working for somebody else. And this, especially in Hungary, in perspective, had been always kind of the thing, right? That sense that, again, it's that oligarch that rules there as a mobster, and whoever leaves around just does whatever the guy says without negotiation in an overwhelmingly rural and country peasant situation remains the same, right? And actually reinforces it along that pattern. Sometimes Banderia could be as small as 25 men. So this really depended on the vassal. It's obvious that, in this sense, this was not really that type of unit we're talking about, so that this acquaints you well to the kind of eventually also organic issues. Like normally when armies gather all these forces, they very often created a single battle lines ad hoc, right? They said, who wants to go in the first, right? Or somebody decided, of course, and then they aggregated differently, and also from places that were quite different in practice. But since tactics, as we were saying before, were pretty much standardized, and at the end of the day it was about these major battle lines composed by hundreds, if not thousands, of men-at-arms charging against one another in this kind of gradual effort of the various lines during the battle, other troops like infantry, missile, mostly on the flanks. Well, that was pretty much standard, and the also relative lack of cadres in this pre-modern armies was also paralleled by a degree of obvious flexibility and fluidity in terms of these armies' composition and, I mean, practical composition for combat purpose. So, as you understand, the size of each Banderium depended on the extent of the vassal's estate. Inevitably, those of the king, queen, and high-ranking court and church officials were the biggest. In fact, the king of Hungary's Banderium was about 7,000 strong. Right, not always, but this reflects fundamentally something very similar that you see, in fact, in the same France, in the same Italy, and in other countries where the major powers have essentially a core of several thousand men-at-arms. They're not quite... they're becoming de facto permanent, right? Especially from the mid-14th century or slightly earlier. The Commune says, for example, that the French Compagnie d'Ordonnance were copied from the Italian lordships' models. Milan had something like 5,000-6,000 men-at-arms by already the end of the first half of the 14th century. So the point was having these men around, right? They were still somehow billeted. They were paid. They received. They had somehow regular employment, meaning that whenever the king needed them, or whoever the lord was locally, they would be readily available. And given that war was fought practically every season, they were just de facto professional troops and permanent in a way or another. Consider that in the 15th century, the despot of Serbia, on account of his lands within Hungary, though, as an Hungarian oligarch, numbered 8,000. This is significant because Serbia, as you know, was just partially ruled by Hungary in different ways, different times, but still who was sent to rule there also had this important private power on its own to assert power there. So this is, again, very significant. And as far as the organization is concerned, this was on a decimal basis, which is quite interesting because it's practically different from the Western one. It's more similar to the Mongolian one, to the steppes one, something that already existed in Hungary, telling the truth, since the time of the Magyar settlement, probably also before, considering the hours, etc. So we have units of 10, 100, 1000. This doesn't mean that they were all exactly numbering like that, nor that the system is properly universal. There were lots of foreign mercenaries. The same Angevins, in a sense, had come there with French Neapolitan knights and so on, so they had a different view on the thing. But this important influence from the Central Asian tradition is deeply and meaningfully showed by the fact that essentially the rear guard was called Dandar, which is the Turkish which is a Turkish loan from Persian, and that you find in the Hungarian army, right? Not in, I don't know, the German army or the Polish army or the Neapolitan army. You have them again for this mastodon in Central Europe that is being also gradually, pushed and eroded and finally dismantled by the Ottomans. That there were, also spreading an important degree of military influence on the road. There was, however, mostly, again, either from Timurid's time, also Persian. The Mongols were always an important, again, element. As we've seen, there were surely Mongols in the same Hungarian armies at this time, as much as in the Ottoman ones. So this name is witness to properly a very important Eastern influence in Hungary that we have documented, by the way, for also the Balkan area, of course, recently in that video about Eastern Balkan warfare during the same, more or less the same time, in the central centuries of the Middle Age. You see there that some melange between Hungarian, Turkish, Italian influences, and even more far away ones like Mongol ones, even Mamluk ones, and so on. Now, these men were maintained, as we've seen, at the vassal's expense, albeit, since they came to be looked upon as private armies at a very early stage, the king effectively paid for them, right? This is a system we have seen for many Central European royal armies. For example, the Polish one during the early modern age, where there are effectively royal offices that, however, are practically bought, militarily speaking, by the various oligarchs, and to serve with a minimal remuneration that serves for the essentially the compensating, so profiting from this business, and of course also increasing the effectiveness of the army, right? So there is, through these mechanisms, an attempt, of course, even in Hungary, to centralize further. But you understand that the Hungarian king still relies de facto on the oligarchs' private armies that could be usually invoked in wartime and that would side the king's forces, even though they were technically under them as contingents on their own. This is, again, typically normal for the times and places. You have normally like a royal banner, is battle line on its own, then you have the guys, I don't know, we have seen the despot of Serbia here, maybe makes up another battle line. And it's not so different from the kind of coalition armies that we've seen elsewhere, on many other occasions. And considering Hungary, even battles that I studied personally with great interest, where you have probably different national contingents that fight within the same army as allies, and that are made up of these very varied forces also from within themselves. In all this, the Angevins tried to boost a sense of noble brotherhood, of chivalric esprit de corps between the king and his leading barons. This is not different from what the French were doing with the Order of the Star under John II, we've seen it recently for the Battle of Poitiers and so on. The same years, right? And in fact, a new chivalric order is strengthened by the creation of the St. George I. That will be very important in this regard. It was still kind of an assessment of the traditional egalitarianism, where also within these orders that essentially embodied divine moral military standard, everybody was alike, right? Also the later Order of the Dragon, this kind of things, they sometimes didn't even properly count anything in a political or even less a military point of view, but it was a way of saying, well, we essentially identify with this group that also somehow overlaps with the kingdom, with the country. So there was a sort of competition, like, are you more or less than this, right? Are you worthy of, as we've seen many other armies, I don't know, participating, sending your son to fight in the king's retinue, right? And there was a lot of, as we've seen before, competition, probably for raising up the ranks, also for these oligarchs to be a bit from in the royal milieu, a bit in your private one, and handling the situation on your own. Now, beneath the barons were the counts, or ispans in Hungary, followed by the castellans of the king's own castles, that, as we've seen in that video on medieval Hungary made a couple of months ago, were sometimes considerably powerful, right? And they worked through this subcontracting system in not a different way this sub-vassals really did on their own. They had important exemptions. This was a way to create, as we've seen properly, a new aristocracy sometimes on their own, right? Or at least having the possibility of injecting always a new force that could also replicate itself over the generations. As a consequence, aside from the Banderium that represents again the hardcore professional system supported by the mercenary ones that today we do not look at, but this is essentially the age of companies. Lots of foreign troops were hired from everywhere, right? Then you have properly the general army of the country. Louis the Great, who succeeded Charles Robert in 1342, recruited German and Italian mercenaries that were used against the Venetian expansion in Dalmatia. There is an interesting Hungarian influence, in fact, in southeastern Germany and in northeastern Italy, where you have all these kind of, the Italians would call them the Barbanicchi, that seemingly is a term deriving from the Bannate, right, from the ban, and so this early tidal power of some sort coming from Croatia, Carniola, Hungary proper, and so on, that have an important mounted archery bias. This is quite interesting because there are mounted crossbowmen pretty much everywhere in Europe, mounted bowmen as well. Many longbowmen, as you know, during the Chevauchée front were mounted, but that are not so popular like even in this neighboring German and Italian lands, as much as they are in fact because of the contact, the injection of these troops as well. So nobody really understands what these troops were made of, if they were just, I don't know, steppes mercenaries, or they were maybe even just local, again, Germans, Slavs, etc., that had began to fight a bit more in that kind of frontier border style that would be even more evident later on in Ottoman times with the Krajina and in the Pannonian plain, right, that favored that kind of warfare and so on. But it's worth, again, remembering that aside from the Hungarian elite made up of the men-at-arms, again, there is, in the broader Hungarian domains, lots of these lighter, especially skirmishers and so on, that will become eventually an ethnic specialty of some sort. But in fact, the Hungarian range is very varied. You have pagan Lithuanians and Catholic Poles that are hired at times in the royal army. Orthodox Serbs to the south. Louis also supported the Pope in Italy and projected himself as the champion of the church. He invaded Naples at a point. He had dreams of crusade against the Turks that were, however, frustrated by the chronic division within the Christian camp. However, the core of the Hungarian army was technically the general levy, right? That is more than a feudal one, and I guess in Hungary this is the difference. In fact, is even greater because, as we've seen, the oligarchic power was somehow habituated to see kind of the private business as the one that made war more viable for the sovereign as well. But the generalis exercitus is sort of a rare band, right? At this point in most countries is anachronistic, but that was always a mandatory service by law, right? For actually the entire lesser nobility as well, and here the difference is a bit blurred because sometimes this lesser nobility, as we'll see, will degenerate in a sort of peasantry, right? In other words, they were gentry, right? And this is something you find in big frontier countries like, in fact, Hungary, like Spain, right? Where at the end of the Reconquista, 1/3 of the adult males were hidalgos, and so what kind of nobility actually was this, if not properly a truly military one, meaning that these people were just habituated in this broader struggle, and deriving some kind of role as even as sort of colonists in newly conquered areas. And this aspect is particularly important in Hungary because there were lots of different ethnicities that were settled at different times. As you know, the Saxons, in a sedentary way, we have seen the nomadic ones from the east, in a way. So the idea that the local communities in this huge country, by the way, dominated by privates, have somehow to come to terms with really defending themselves on their own, because the king very often cannot even think to project the royal army in frontiers like, I don't know, the Wallachian one, even across the Carpathians, etc., made this communities a bit more militarized. Again, this is the picture in Central and Eastern Europe. More sparse population, more difficult communications, more probably agricultural environment. So you are just again, that statal presence is much looser, and consequently the local communities are much more habituated to take matters in their own hands, as far as properly also a militia system was concerned. This doesn't mean that it was necessarily effective. It was in fact just militia, so they couldn't compete against the broader professional system. But as you know, most armies were numerically made up of these people as well. Just think about Transylvania and how it had historically, and in this area, again, the stretches from the Balkans to Eastern Europe, you had like a crescent. You see in the military style, the fighting style, a degree of militarization necessary to cope against the raiders of the steppes. There are somehow the equivalent of a militia as well, and the cemeteries were stronger, telling the truth. And that is, albeit, again, a modest force, sometimes capable also through guerrilla ambushes to counter even larger force. I mean, even the Hungarian royal army, as you know, has trouble in asserting control in the frontier, in Transylvania, even in the Banat. There are interesting. It's always stretched, as we'll see now. Most noblemen were also properly not willing to serve for a longer term that they were just like 2 weeks, right? So it's ridiculous, of course, by the 14th century, where warfare has become way beyond seasonal to ask just for 2 weeks of service. But this tells you also, in a sense, how less monetized the system was, and how more seasonal by a certain degree. Of course, also this particular area still was. This is somehow typical of the region. An interesting feature of the Hungarian generalis exercitus is that it entailed a very, and traditionally, large amount of cavalry as well. So lighter cavalry, the lighter type we were talking about before, because it was more readily available. Many people, even as west as the Pannonian Plain, still lived in that kind of transhumant, if not almost, in fact, semi-nomadic way, and so they were more habituated to just live on the raid, right? And when the royal army moved, of course, all these people that were definitely not swimming in gold would join just to raid, pillage, loot, and so on. And these great parties were organized. It happened in the early 14th century. You have those aforementioned forces, I don't know, devastating the Friulan plain, not very differently from what the Ottomans will do themselves, and just because basically they would be still the same people later on in the 15th and the 16th century, because these were still subjects of the same area, right? And that was their lifestyle, and by a degree even increasingly unstable, given especially the consequences of the Ottoman expansion. Thus, what Hungary could mobilize through the the Arjarband was considerable. Some consider that some tens of thousands of families by the 15th century were counted as gentry, this lesser nobility that had to pick up arms in a traditional lifestyle, right? However, by a law of 1222 that we have seen in the aforementioned video, medieval Hungary, this could only be called upon to serve within the boundaries of Hungary and only for 15 days. So not being obliged to serve beyond the frontier at all. In theory, maybe these people routinely participated to such raids, especially in the frontier areas, but just for personal gain, they would sell their services to someone else. Some were legitimately just not particularly inclined to do that anymore because it costed too much. In certain situations, they had gentrified, they wanted just to live like a normal farming or mercantile life. But again, the degree of habituation to especially raiding warfare was something like it that probably also excited the Magyar mindset. Such constrictions imposed upon a military expedition are well evidenced by an episode of 1439 where the Hungarian lesser nobility abandoned King Albert I of Habsburg's army during a campaign against the Ottomans because their 2 weeks were up, obliging the king, thus left without a satisfactory amount of troops, to abandon his undertaking. Right, this is just an example, and there were many others, but it well exemplifies, first of all, the importance, after all, that this general levy had for within the bulk of the kingdom's army, right? Secondly, the fact that, of course, this was also a political system, right? If those men had to fight for their own homes, they would have stayed in service as long as they needed. And the fact that this was a campaign against the Ottomans that you would think to be the major threat to Hungary, and in perspective they were, but in more relative terms to the single episodes, campaigns, whatever, at some point it was not so obvious because there was nothing deterministic about the Ottomans taking over the region and succeeding so right up to very late, right? But it's still quite meaningful even in the face of threat because eventually these territories were to be ruled by the Ottomans, and so if the system had been strong, had been successful and whatever, these same communities would have not remained for centuries under the same Ottoman rule, which is again the thing that everybody likes to forget for reasons that are not historical, right? Because nobody can rule over a community if this community doesn't want to be ruled. The degree of brutality to which these wars were fought, etc., of course shows that by a certain degree there was a ruthless subjugation carried out by all involved, but that at the same time, and given the leverage that at some point also the local noblemen could do and so on, there was a negotiation. Like the oligarchs at some point decided that it was perhaps better to remain under the Ottomans than trying to revive. Like the Hungarian kingdom technically remained, at least it was split, as you know, in various parts between the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, and so on. But in a way, again, when we think about the great sieges of Vienna and so on, many of these troops were Hungarian, right? And there was also a general, beyond the Ottomans policy waged by these men, because they wanted to counter, the same Catholics in Austria, and hoping to spread kind of their own influence there confessionally. So all the reasons that you can imagine do not make this like one versus another, but something at least varying largely in degree, and with many other actors at a time. Now, as you can imagine, by the way, this general army was not so efficient like the Banderia. Thus, organization, leadership from the side of, again, the lesser nobility, that as we've seen was taken out increasingly of the game, of military organization, political control, was ever less effective. In fact, by the early 15th century, at the very latest, this force was comprised largely by ill-armed upper-class peasantry, and serving chiefly on foot. Right, the horses were used mostly for transport. This is an interesting aspect. Of course, there is also a tendency, as we were saying before, to have also during the 15th century an increase in infantry effectiveness in a general sense, but this is not the case of military quality we're talking about here. Here we see the collapse of an estate that had, up to some point, had a general military aptness and capacity that now had dramatically impoverished and was shrinking, right, properly from a political and social point of view, and so also in military effectiveness. So in this picture, consider that Hungary was suffering heavy blows. As the Ottomans advanced deep into the Balkans, King Sigismund called a crusade, but as you know, this actually largely French force met with disaster at the Battle of Nicopolis, in which the Saint Sigismund managed to survive, escaping. And despite the mortal threat posed by the Ottomans, Hungary still directed its own efforts westwards. In part, this was caused by the dynastic games that we illustrated also last year in that videos on the destinies of the empire, where Hungary played a very important role, because there was a dynastic sum, again, this the Jagiellonians, the Luxembourgs, the Habsburgs, etc., sharing power through marrying to each other, so essentially strengthening that further that monarchic elite, also at the expense of at least trying to curb in the process the oligarchic power in their own countries. But there were also other concrete territorial issues, right? Dalmatia was ceded to Venice. The vital southern territory on the Danube and beyond was lost, right? And that was the key to the same Hungarian plain. That's where the Ottomans would swarm eventually into the country. So these are all indicators of a substantial weakening, right? Political disintegration. You can't lose such important territories. Doesn't matter how frontier they are, but that shows that there is a greater power from the other side. And at this point, barons were more habituated just to rely on foreign mercenaries, as well as the familiares, as their retinues were called in Latin. So personal retainers mostly, and or other clansmen, to make up their banderia, right? This other militias, as we've seen, had lost an important military role. We'll see them in other videos also more accurately. And at this point, as a consequence, also the king had lost control over part of his, not just the territories, but politically on the on the same Banderia of the various vassals, right? So um, actually, this was a way to scapegoat them whenever, say, an enemy scored a success, because these guys that were the most difficult to reach suffered a defeat on the frontier. It was kind of their problem, because they had wanted their own privacy, their own personal armies, and so if they couldn't even defend their own territory, at least it was their fault for having driven themselves ever more distant from the monarchy. That's the struggle again in Central Europe between the ruling dynasty and the various vassals, that instead was evolving in a more functional sense in the West. There was in the same royal army at the time of Sigismund under his successor Albert the need to raise new men that were essentially mercenaries. For example, the Italian condottiere Pippo Scolari, who dominated the southern frontier, like carving a power basically on his own. There were other important commanders such as the regent and local knights, as Uniadi, Janos, who came to prominence in southeastern Transylvania. So this was a moment, an opportunity, let's say, for some important figures, either foreign or domestic, to take the reins of the situation. But it still depicts fragility of the broader system that, in this case, explains the Ottoman success on the longer run. Of course, again, things may have gone differently. A battle at some point, as you know, think about the siege of Belgrade, 1456. We made videos about the Balkan Crusades. Those were moments in which the Ottomans could still be pushed back. Again, there was nothing about the Turks managing to conquer this region, say, unescapable. But at the same time, there was not enough force, right? The Habsburgs at some point let Hungary die, because they were pressured by her in the same level. They eventually had to cope with the Ottomans themselves. This was completely normal in a broader sense. It was a greater problem of the crusade, organizing this external support, but all showing that Hungary alone, gradually, its military system couldn't really make it, right? So, speaking of the army composition, the numbers, and we will observe all the things we previously said in much better in other dedicated videos. In any case, again, there is a Hungarian history playlist, there is an Ottoman warfare playlist, so there are plenty of references, and we will cover the single battles and army organizations even further. But when we have to assess the strength, the numerical one at least, of the Hungarian army at this point, what do we rely on, even just methodologically? Well, during the 14th century, the largest armies were seemingly the ones who marched to Zara in 1345, where at least we have numbers like 80,000, including Hungarians, Bosnians, Austrians, Croats, Bohemians, and Styrians, which shows you the composition of the army in times in which not all of these lands were under Hungary, by the way. So showing on how many foreign forces Hungary was relying. Some of these contingents were actually mercenaries, but they also are coming from areas that do not really represent over which Hungary really has a grip per se, or where it can simply attract forces from in a general sense to serve permanently on its own. These are mostly gathered with a broader purpose of loot and so on, rather than a truly permanent service. Then there is the force gathered around, against the Sultan Bayezid I at Nicopolis in 1396. And regarding the latter, the numbers are interesting because there are different contemporary sources, essentially all foreign ones. It is also important to stress that give wildly differing numbers. Schildberger, for example, says 16,000, Froissart 60,000, and Philippe de Mézières 150,000. And so, as far as the modern estimates are concerned, as we were saying before, pretending that even the largest army of a major country like Hungary could field more than 30,000 men to have them functionally employed in a single army from a tactical point of view is nothing short of ridiculous, right? So when people say, well, but we can't say something like, maybe there were 80, 100,000 men. Yeah, my eyes, right? Not even, the greatest power in Europe couldn't field those numbers, even by, minimally. And even with which purpose? Do you understand the political, even before the economical? Because that's the thing, cost. Do you realize if what would have happened if Hungary had enforced or managed to bring in something like 100,000 or even just 80,000 men? That's insane, right? There is not especially in an offensive operation, there is not properly the political pressure to bring more than 30,000 men efficiently on the field and campaign and having minimally the money to pay them, right? This is, of course, ridiculous in a broader sense. People say, well, but Froissart says that that Bayezid had estimated the strength of the whole Christian army at Nicopolis like at 100,000, which is repeated also by the biographer of Marshal Boucicaut, had also fought in Balkans and so on. But if people had just read medieval chronicles and had looked at what normally these chroniclers really did, you know what they did? They were extremely precise normally within their own region, right? They said accurately, and we can reconstruct in a very precise manner, actually, even the size of major armies. Then if somebody was fighting, let's say, in Andalusia or in Hungary or somewhere that is not even that far away, you see that they immediately start shooting things like, these were 100,000 men on a regular basis. And the point is that they didn't even, let's say, present these numbers because they were pretending to be believed, right? Because people cared less about what happened in such faraway places. Doesn't even matter whether there had been, I don't know, in that case, French Burgundian crusaders that had been ended up massacred by the Ottomans. The point is that it's another world, right? And yes, those people can access it, but the general audience there doesn't quite know as much as would be known if that battle had been fought like in the heart of France herself. So no, right? We just know this statistically that it's not real. In fact, if you read in those instances, even the local Spanish chronicles, sources, whatever, they tell you something else, because locally they, of course, had less reasons to just throw these numbers just for the sake of it. The problem with the Balkans is that, as we were saying before, they're much less documented in general, and that also Islamic historiography doesn't quite provide with such precise numbers or even quantity of information like the Western one. We've seen it very often during the Crusades. Like Frankish chronicles say, well, this meant realistically we're just like in the few thousands, even when they exaggerated the number of the Turks. That was evidently a standard number given as an approximation. You read the Arab chronicles, and before even realizing that the number is, of course, excessive, things like 100,000, for the enemy's multitude, that these are just figures of speech, they're rhetorical. The way the entire chronicle is written has a completely different mindset, objective, and an interest compared just to, say, the Western one. Because it's a different culture, and it thinks in a different way. And it doesn't care, also objectively, to tell you accurately how many those men were. And very often also, we're talking about later sources that maybe we quote from centuries afterwards, because again there are less chronicles, and that's in that historiography, and so we say, yeah, this other Arab author says this, yes, but he lived like 200 years later. He evidently doesn't know what he's talking about just because it's too distant. And we don't do the same thing with in the West, because just today as moderns, I mean, you don't go look for a 15th century source about a battle fought in the 13th. It's dumb. Nobody does it, but for some reason we do it, because you say, well, but look, I'm good because I found a historian from 200 years later still talks about the battle. Yes, but why do you even consider it, at least without saying that, of course, it doesn't quite have any consistency compared to the previous events. The same can be said for even for countries, again, as close as the Balkans or Eastern Europe, because again the information is just much scarcer, even when they add details to it, because adding details doesn't quite mean necessarily. And I dare say that this continues still today. For example, there was an Egyptian Coptologist who was a Coptic historian, a scholar, an expert in Islamic and Crusade studies, Aziz Surreal Atiyah, who died, I think, like in the 80s, so it's a relatively quoted authority, and he simply says in his account, like, yeah, well, of course, the Crusader army totaled 100,000 men. Yeah, of course. Like, which the Hungarian element, by the way, comprised, that's the elements under the Hungarian crown, says 60,000 Hungarians. Yeah, because notoriously, normally the army of a country fielded normally 60,000 men, plus others, by the way, because, if it hadn't been just for the political side of the story, where do you find 60,000 ethnic Hungarians that are able, to be fielded without making properly the entire political structure collapse, just out of the sheer effort that would require, not causing a revolution fundamentally. Plus 10,000 Wallachians and 13,000 Styrian, Bohemian, Polish, and Italian mercenaries and crusaders mixed. Where do you find logistics for that? Like, do you literally think that a late medieval army was capable of doing this? And keeping this together for the purpose of a single campaign, a single battle. This is at least triple the actual figure. There's another authority that says that the Hungarian army was made up of 36,000 Hungarians, 26,000 Hungarian mercenaries. So mercenaries paid by Hungary. So again, this would make 62,000 soldiers. Where the hell do you think that Hungary was able alone to field that? On a normal expedition, not causing a massive jam and having this army basically just standing on his feet, but being impossible to wield, to control, to send anywhere. 16,000 Transylvanian infantry, 10,000 Wallachians, and 12,000 German Bohemian mercenaries. That is also in this case 100,000 men in all, which is also ridiculous. Again, even in this case, just 1/3 of the total seems fair. It would make 20,000 Hungarians, something around, but almost 9,000 Hungarian mercenaries, which is already a lot, frankly. And then something like 5,000 Transylvanians, 3,000 Wallachians, 4,000 German and Bohemian mercenaries. And this already sounds definitely too crowded, right? Especially the mercenaries, telling the truth, because to have the rabble that follows just as a general, like pioneers, like field aids like again in the subtle terrain. Okay, you can count that, but it's not fighting force. And definitely the heaviness reached by Western warfare in terms probably of individual men-at-arms and so on, the cost of their service, their panoply, their horses. Where do you place all the horses? Just think about the hygienic conditions that you must be in not to make this thing having an epidemic immediately. Just in the first place, this has been assembled without moving, reaching Nicopolis, counting these mercenaries in the thousands, but they were actual elite in practice, and also the decisive one. No, you don't have several tens of thousands of these troops. There is no army at the time that had them anywhere, right? Being able to field them. One thing is saying like an entire state had that in the form of course, they had even much more than this probably, but it wasn't to be fielded. Nobody could field that. That there wasn't the political strength, the logistical capacity to have under a unitary command by anyone, not just the king, such a huge mass of men. But numbers run, because again, one authority says that, and so it becomes, okay, well, let's say it's possible, even of course what we're actually saying here is that it's, again, a gravely under-documented event for the importance of the saying, which the Battle of Nicopolis definitely was, etc. And so we need to compensate by giving a number just because of, at least make this criticism, at least say that, but we actually have much better idea of how large an army could be at the time, and at least we can go with that. And other authorities, in fact, fortunately, do. So, as I was saying since the beginning, there is much more to say about the Hungarian army during the Middle Ages, not just the latter part. And it was a very complex system, and also actually a well-organized one. I mean, considering, in spite of the difficulties that we have highlighted, that are especially of political nature, there were many interesting probably strategic features. I mean, just the fact that you have this major power in a base plane, that you have the Danube in the southern frontier, and then an important degree of citadels, strongholds that you have to defend and trying to assert your control in this frontier, and then also an eastern frontier where to intervene. This would bring to loss, first of all, of just extensionally, the external influences were very, very variegated. The main one at this point, late medieval times, was definitely Westerner. We see a lot of Milanese armor around. The Danubian valley was just the main highway also for these exports and so on. We see this important also French, German influence as well. And so that towards the end of the Middle Ages, as you can see also in the same Byzantine Empire, brings to a hardcore westernization as the face of the elite. Right, in Central Europe, you definitely see this Gothic full plate armor, just like you see in Germany in the same way. Again, the lesser element is much more ethnic, and it remains so. As you know, Hungary would spread also an important equestrian culture with the Hussar model in Poland, eventually in the same West. But it's just, again, at the defense of Constantinople in 1453, the Byzantine army looks at that point practically identical in equipment to a Western one, right? And there are also these interesting Middle Eastern influences through I think as far as Mamluk Egypt, there is surely a Central Asian influence through the Mongol model. We've seen it with the decimal system, even a Persian one, Middle Eastern influence with the Dandar, that a name used in Hungary to call the vanguard in Persian. And this phase, especially of the steppe, I would say, that's always overlooked, like what influenced Europe in that kind of more Eastern outlook wasn't quite much of a southern thing, but an Eastern thing, right? And Hungary had definitely grown enormously from that since the settlement. I mean, the Magyars crossed the Eurasian steppes, receiving a dramatic amount of Middle Eastern military influence. You can easily see it in their armor, in their siege warfare capability. By the way, since our times, this is something that precedes actually even Magyar history in the Hungarian plain, right? That was probably an area in Europe that was so close, so much closer than we think, as a frontier, but not in the sense as a border that could not be penetrated. Quite the contrary, right? And it would remain a frontier area for a very long time. Again, lots of videos to make on Hungary. We didn't talk about the Militia Portalis. We didn't talk about the Black Army. Some of you asked me. I know, I promise, time allowing, I will cover everything of that. Just I hardly make videos on demand, and if I do, it's just not to satisfy like, oh, the Black Army, like as if that was the only thing that one had to know about medieval Hungary. Again, I am triggered by how, let's say, populistic the interest, so populistic, thus culturally underdeveloped, the historical interest of the masses unavoidably, as the Fourth Estaters really are. You know, there is an entire context to understand. Why do you want, I know, it's a rhetoric question, you want to hear, wherever you come from, that, you know, army or unit or leader that, this was such the great leader in my country, it was so your country is much more than that, right? And if you just sclerotize to that, you basically lose any meaning or awareness or knowledge, if you ever had any, telling the truth, about your own very country, right? It's just silly, right? If you just know about the Vikings, about Scandinavian history, it means that you don't know anything about Scandinavian history. If you just know about the Romans, about Italy, it means you know nothing about Italian history, etc., etc. So I'm not going to fuel that kind of hype, because I like rationale, discipline, and in this sense method, patience, right, and understanding. And of course I will cover, however, everything, but all at its own time, and also giving it the right proportion, because at least I discussed most of the Middle Ages, and there is always cyclicity in the topics I pick, and they are all very well balanced. So there are certain things that literally nobody knows about, and that are as important or even more important sometimes than others that everybody knows about. So what people know, frankly, is irrelevant, right? It's not an intelligent criterion, and it must be corrected brutally if necessary through these means and through this dialectic. In any case, as I was saying before, you can find all in my playlists. Just, you know, click on the search function on the channel playlist, and you will find everything about Hungary, about any age, right? Also the Magyars, the hours before, whatever. So I always leave you with that acknowledgement, because it seems like that people just have no clue about what this channel has in practice. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.